He'd built empires in glass towers, commanded boardrooms with a glance, and thought life had nothing left to teach him until a barefoot boy on a back-road Kentucky highway said no thanks to his money and walked away. What begins as a flat tire becomes a crack in everything Matthew Evans believed about power, pride, and what it means to be worth something. But when the man who once measured value and profits finds himself chasing a boy who owns nothing but his principles, the real question emerges. Can a life of wealth be undone by a single act of kindness? And would that be such a bad thing? But first, leave a comment below to let us know where you are watching from, and if you like fascinating stories like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we have another incredible story, and there are many surprises waiting for you in the next parts. Matthew Evans sat behind the wheel of his silver Mercedes, tapping his thumb against the steering wheel in quiet agitation. The car's air conditioner hummed at full blast, struggling to keep the Kentucky heat from creeping in, but it was losing. Beads of sweat gathered at his temples despite the luxury surrounding him. Leather seats, custom wood trim, a dashboard that looked more like a cockpit. This was a man who hadn't waited in decades. CEOs didn't wait. Titans of finance didn't break a sweat. But there he was, waiting like a stranded rookie in a suit too expensive for the setting, and a flat tire mocking him from the roadside. He had tried calling for help, of course, but his cell signal had vanished somewhere between take the next left and you've arrived. Now it was just him, the heat, and the sobering realization that even his money was useless out here. He stared into the road's wavering distance, the horizon shimmering in waves of heat, when he saw movement. At first, a shadow, then a figure. A boy, maybe 13 or 14, walking down the road like he belonged there. Shirt faded, sneakers battered, hair stuck to his forehead. Matthew stiffened, uncertain. The boy stopped a few feet from the car, gave a nod like they'd met before, and asked, "Got a flat, sir?" His voice was calm, polite, like he'd done this 100 times. "Yes," Matthew said slowly. "No signal. I was hoping for some help." The boy offered a soft grin, already crouching beside the wheel. "I can handle it. My grandpa taught me. You got a spare?" He moved without hesitation, pulling open the trunk and rummaging through the tools like he owned the moment. Matthew watched, arms folded, unsure if he was impressed, embarrassed, or both. The job took minutes. The boy's hands moved quickly, confidently, not a single wasted gesture. He didn't fill the silence with nervous chatter or bragging. He just worked. And when he was done, he stood up, wiped his hands on his jeans, and said, "All set." Matthew reached for his wallet instinctively, peeled off a few bills, and held them out. "Thank you, really, take this." But the boy took a step back and lifted his hand in polite refusal. "I don't need anything, sir. Just happy to help." And just like that, he turned and started walking away. Matthew stood there, bills still in his hand, mouth slightly open. He watched the boy disappear into the heat, each step echoing louder than it should have. It wasn't the refusal that rattled him. It was how effortless it was. No hesitation, no shame. The boy acted like helping was just what people do. Matthew, a man who had built a life around transactions and returns, suddenly felt like a beginner at a game he didn't understand. That moment, quiet as it was, cracked something deep. The boy had walked away empty-handed, but left Matthew feeling like the poorer man. And in that stillness, for the first time in a long time, Matthew Evans found himself wanting answers that money couldn't buy. The drive back to his estate should have felt like relief. The air was cooler now, the roads clearer, and the flat tire was behind him, just a glitch in an otherwise polished day. But Matthew Evans couldn't focus. The boy's face kept surfacing, uninvited, like a ghost in the passenger seat. He couldn't remember the names of junior partners he'd hired last quarter, or the lobbyist who'd flown in for lunch last week. But he could remember the calluses on that boy's hands, the dust on his jeans, the quiet way he'd said, "Just happy to help." That line clung to him like sweat on leather, sticky and persistent, refusing to evaporate. He tried turning on the radio. Silence. He tried reviewing market forecasts on the dash screen. Numbers blurred. For the first time in decades, Matthew wasn't thinking about quarterly gains or board appointments. He was thinking about a kid who walked away richer in something he couldn't name. He pulled into the curved driveway of his mansion with a familiar tap of the remote. The wrought iron gates opened slowly, like a butler bowing in reverse. The house loomed, tall and perfect, cast in evening gold. He parked beneath the porte-cochere and stepped out, greeted by silence. Inside, the temperature was perfectly calibrated, the lights soft and tasteful. A glass of wine waited on the sideboard. His housekeeper always prepped it for him before leaving at 5. The kitchen was spotless, untouched. On the table sat a plated steak, still warm under its silver cloche, asparagus arranged in practiced symmetry. He sat, took a bite, chewed, swallowed nothing. The boy's voice echoed louder than the clicking of his utensils. "I don't need anything, sir." It had been said without pride or pity, just fact. The kind of fact that made this house, this glass palace of curated success, suddenly feel hollow. The silence in his home was louder than the boy's simple "no thank you." He stood and wandered through the house, past artwork he'd never really looked at, shelves lined with first editions he'd never opened, and furniture that looked more like museum pieces than anything meant to be used. Every object was expensive. None of it felt valuable. In his study, the mahogany desk waited under soft, recessed lighting, a symbol of a career built on precision and force. But tonight, the air in the room felt stale. He sank into the leather chair and stared at nothing. This wasn't the first time someone had helped him, but it was the first time it hadn't come with an invoice or an angle. The boy hadn't asked for recognition, hadn't even given a last name. There'd been no favor to return, no opportunity to leverage. And yet, here Matthew was, replaying the moment like it was a deal he'd missed. He had built a life out of what people wanted: status, salary, leverage. But the boy didn't want anything, and that was exactly why he couldn't stop thinking about him. A man like Matthew lived by exchanges. You give, you get. You invest, you earn. Every relationship had a ledger. Even generosity, in his world, was a performance. A tax write-off, a name on a gala banner. He'd shaken hands with presidents, closed deals over million-dollar dinners, and flown private for the sake of a handshake. But this boy had made him feel seen in a way none of that ever had. Seen and then left behind like a man who didn't have anything worth offering. That kind of honesty didn't happen in his world. And yet it had happened, on a dusty road, with a stranger who walked away with empty pockets and full dignity. What kind of person refuses money when they clearly don't have much? And, more importantly, what kind of life had Matthew built if he couldn't understand that answer? He stared at the glowing city skyline outside his window and felt a shift, faint but real. For the first time in years, he thought about his parents. His father's cracked hands fixing things in the yard. His mother's stubborn pride in hand-me-down dishes polished like silver. He'd grown up with very little, but not once had he felt poor. The difference, he now realized, was that back then people showed up for each other because it was right, not because they needed something in return. And he had buried that part of himself under decades of polished deals and social insulation. The boy, Elijah, he didn't know his name yet, but it felt right. It wasn't just kind, he was rooted in something Matthew had lost a long time ago and maybe couldn't name even now. He had values that couldn't be written into contracts or printed on stock certificates. Watching him walk away had been like looking at a younger, unspoiled version of himself, someone Matthew hadn't met in years. That night, he tossed in silk sheets that suddenly felt too smooth, too sterile. The wine didn't settle him, the steak remained untouched. The house creaked in places he'd never noticed before. It wasn't guilt exactly, and it wasn't pity either. It was more like friction, like a thread had been pulled and something inside was unraveling. He couldn't explain it, not even to himself. All he knew was that the silence no longer felt like peace. It felt like a question he didn't yet know how to answer, and as he finally sat up in bed, the image of the boy walking away, dust clinging to his sneakers, back straight, hands empty, played again in his mind. That was not a moment he could afford to forget, because it hadn't just changed his day. It had cracked open something older, something deeper, and whatever it wasn't finished with him yet. The next morning came sooner than Matthew expected, not because of an alarm, but because sleep had left him hours before the sun rose. He didn't move like a retiree. There was no sluggish stretch, no lazy coffee stroll to the patio. He got up with a kind of urgency he hadn't felt since his early 30s, back when ambition ran through his veins like jet fuel. But this wasn't about ambition. He wasn't going to the club. He wasn't going to check on investments. He wasn't even sure where he was going, only that he had to. He threw on clothes that didn't match his usual careful polish. Faded jeans, a polo shirt he hadn't worn in years, shoes without shine. There was something in his chest, tight and restless. It wasn't a tire he needed fixed. It was a thread in himself he needed to stitch back together. The boy had walked away, but the moment hadn't. It clung to him like the scent of rain after a storm, and now it was pulling him back down that road, back to the heat, the dust, and the moment where everything began to shift. He drove slow at first, scanning every turnoff, every bend in the road, half expecting to see the boy again, walking like some spirit of conscience. But the road was empty, so he started stopping. A gas station with peeling paint and a sun-faded Pepsi sign, a diner with more dust than customers. At each stop, he asked the same question in slightly different ways. "Have you seen a young boy out this way? Maybe 13, slim build, wears beat-up sneakers? Helped me with a flat yesterday." The cashier shrugged. The waitress at the diner gave him a puzzled look and shook her head. At a second gas station, the attendant didn't even look up from his lottery tickets. Time passed, and with it the fragile confidence Matthew had brought with him. He began to feel foolish. What was he even doing? Chasing a child who didn't ask to be found? What would he say if he did find him? "Thank you again," this time with more money, more weight behind it. Then, somewhere between giving up and trying one last place, he stepped into a small cafe on the edge of a county line. It smelled like old bacon and brewed hope. A woman in her 60s stood behind the counter, drying mugs with a towel that had seen better days. She looked at him the way people in small towns look at strangers, with curiosity but not concern. "Can I help you, hon?" she asked, not unkindly. He gave her the now familiar description, bracing himself for another no. But instead, her brow lifted. She gave a soft laugh and shook her head like she couldn't believe the answer was that easy. "Sounds like you're talking about Elijah," she said, folding the towel in half. "That boy's always helping folks. Lives over in Harlan with his mama." Matthew blinked. He hadn't realized how badly he needed a name until he had one. Elijah. It settled on his tongue like a prayer and a challenge at once. "Harlan," he repeated, already mentally planning the drive. The woman nodded. "About an hour from here, up near the foothills. You'll know it when you get there. Just follow the mountain." He thanked her and stepped back out into the heat, his pulse kicking up like it used to when a deal finally broke open. He wasn't just retracing his steps now. He had a direction, a name, and a reason that went deeper than even he could explain. The road to Harlan wound through the early arms of the Appalachians, green and lush with towering trees and quiet creeks, the kind of beauty that didn't ask to be admired but offered itself anyway. Matthew barely noticed. His eyes were on the road, but his mind was still on the boy. Elijah. The name made it real. He wasn't just an echo of a moment anymore. He was someone, somewhere, living a life that had somehow brushed against Matthew's with enough force to shake it loose. Matthew had spent his life chasing numbers. Numbers on screens, numbers in accounts, numbers on buildings named after men like him. Now he was chasing a kid who wouldn't take $5. That kind of reversal didn't happen to people like Matthew. And yet, here he was, following a trail built on nothing more than a feeling and a face he couldn't forget. He arrived in Harlan just before noon. The town looked like it had been paused mid-sentence sometime in the 1970s and never quite resumed. Storefronts with hand-painted signs, pickup trucks parked on gravel shoulders, and porches that sagged under the weight of time. He asked around again, and this time the answers came easier. "Elijah?" one man said while fixing a screen door. "Yeah, I know that kid. Helps my wife carry groceries sometimes. Lives with his mom, last house on the edge of town." That was enough. Matthew followed the directions slowly, part of him hesitant now that the destination was in sight. What was he hoping to find? Gratitude? Closure? Or maybe just proof that the moment he'd felt wasn't imagined? He turned down a narrow road and saw the house. It was humble, tired in some places, but clearly cared for. A crooked porch, a wind chime that sang in the breeze. It wasn't picturesque, but it was lived in. It was honest, and it looked like the kind of place that builds people like Elijah. The contrast hit him hard. His own home was bigger than this entire street, but it had never felt this grounded. He parked the car and sat for a moment, collecting himself. Then, with more nerves than he wanted to admit, he stepped out and walked to the porch. Before he could knock, the screen door opened. A woman stood there, early 40s maybe, with a tired grace and eyes that missed nothing. She didn't look surprised to see him, just curious. "Can I help you?" she asked, voice steady. "Good morning," Matthew said, clearing his throat. "I'm sorry to bother you. I believe I met your son yesterday, Elijah. He helped me with a flat tire." At the mention of the name, her posture softened slightly, and the corner of her mouth lifted. "That sounds like my Elijah," she said. "Always helping someone. You're not the first person to come looking." He felt something shift inside, a flicker of embarrassment and admiration. "He wouldn't take anything from me," Matthew said. I wanted to thank him properly." She studied him for another second, then stepped aside, holding the door open. "He's out back, working on the fence. You're welcome to wait." Matthew stepped into the house, unsure what he was walking into, but knowing without a doubt he was exactly where he needed to be. The door clicked softly behind Matthew as he stepped into the house. The air inside was cool but not cold, touched with the smell of something baked earlier that morning. The floor creaked beneath his shoes, and he immediately felt like every step was louder than it needed to be. The living room to his left was simple. Modest couch, a coffee table with scuffed edges, a stack of folded laundry on a nearby chair, but it was all clean, intentional, cared for. The walls were dotted with family photos in mismatched frames. A graduation portrait here, a birthday party snapshot there. Interspersed among them were childish drawings, rocket ships, a smiling sun, a house with wobbly windows and hearts in the yard. Matthew stood there in silence, his tailored shirt suddenly feeling stiff, his watch suddenly weighty. He felt overdressed, overbuilt, oversized in this space. He was a man who'd spent decades polishing marble and glossing over imperfection, but in that home he felt like a gilded statue in a kitchen made of clay and care. The mother led him through the back door without ceremony, her tone casual. "He's just finishing up the corner post." Matthew stepped out into the backyard where the sun cast soft light over a patchy lawn and a leaning swing set with one good chain. Elijah was there, focused on the fence line, driving a nail into a weathered board with careful hands. He looked up and blinked, surprised but not startled. "Hey, mister," he said with a grin. "Didn't expect to see you again." Matthew chuckled lightly, unsure how to start. "Didn't expect to be back, but here I am." He walked slowly toward the boy, the gravel crunching beneath his loafers. "I just wanted to thank you again. I couldn't get it out of my head what you did." Elijah stood and wiped his palms on his jeans. "It wasn't a big deal," he said with a shrug. "Tire was flat, I knew how to fix it, that's all." His tone wasn't humble, it was matter-of-fact. Like he hadn't done anything special, like kindness was standard. Matthew leaned against the fence beside him, not looking directly at the boy. "It is a big deal. At least it was to me." Elijah tilted his head, curious. "Why?" The question was simple, but it cut deep. Matthew took a breath, longer than necessary. "Because in my world, people don't do things without wanting something back. Everything's a transaction. A deal. You didn't want anything." Elijah looked down for a second, then back at Matthew with quiet clarity. If I can help someone, why wouldn't I? The simplicity of the statement left no room for rebuttal, no space for cynicism. It wasn't philosophy or performance, it was just how he saw the world. Matthew nodded slowly, the words circling in his mind. In that moment, he realized it wasn't just the act that had moved him, it was the fact that Elijah existed at all. Someone so young, who hadn't been twisted by expectation or hardened by deals. There was a long pause before Matthew found the next words. "You changed something in me yesterday," he said. You didn't even know it, but you did. I've done a lot in my life, made a lot, but when I saw you walk away, I've never felt more unsure about what I actually have." Elijah didn't respond right away. He just listened. No interruption, no pity, just stillness. And that unsettled Matthew more than any speech would have, because the boy wasn't trying to comfort him, he was letting the truth land on its own, and somehow that gave it more weight. "You remind me of who I thought I'd be," Matthew said, the words thick in his throat. "Back when I was younger, before all the success. I think I lost that part of me." Elijah looked at him for a beat, then nodded once. "Maybe you just forgot," he said. "Doesn't mean it's gone." It wasn't a line meant to inspire, it was just another truth dropped like a pebble into water. But the ripples reached far. "Lunch!" Elijah's mother called from the back door, wiping her hands on a towel. Her voice was light, familiar. Elijah glanced toward the house. "You want to stay? Mom makes a good roast chicken." Matthew hesitated. He'd eaten in Michelin-starred restaurants, been served by waiters who memorized his Scotch preference down to the ice cube, but somehow this invitation, a simple offer made without fanfare, felt heavier than a 7-course meal. "I'd like that," he said, his voice quieter than usual. He followed Elijah inside, where the dining table sat under a crooked ceiling fan. The table was small, surrounded by mismatched chairs, one leg propped with a folded magazine. Plates were set out already, nothing fancy, just solid ceramic and worn silverware. A bowl of roasted vegetables sat steaming in the middle, the scent of garlic and rosemary rising in the air. Elijah took his seat without ceremony. His mother poured tea into glasses that didn't match. There was no toast, no speech, just a meal shared by people who didn't pretend to be more than they were. They talked as they ate. Elijah spoke about school, how he liked science but hated history because it never made room for people like him. He talked about his dream of becoming an engineer, about building things that lasted. Matthew listened, really listened, the way he hadn't in years. His own boardroom conversations were filled with noise, metrics, growth, bottom lines. But here every sentence was deliberate. His mother shared bits about their town, about neighbors who pitched in when someone got sick, about how people didn't have much but tried to give what they could. There was pride in her voice, not pity. Laughter came easily between them. Stories rolled out like warm biscuits, messy and imperfect and deeply nourishing. Matthew didn't speak much. Because in that kitchen, smaller than his pantry, with peeling wallpaper and chipped mugs, he found something bigger than his mansion had ever held. A sense of enough. A sense of real. A sense that maybe, just maybe, the most valuable thing he'd been given in years was the chance to sit at that table and be reminded of the man he still could be. When Matthew stepped back into his car, the leather no longer felt like a throne. It felt like a reminder, a whisper that he'd been sitting above the world for too long. He didn't start the engine right away. Instead, he sat with his hands on the wheel, looking out at the little house with the sagging porch, the yard patched with effort instead of sod, and the family that had let him in without condition. Something in him had shifted, not snapped, not shattered, shifted, subtly but completely. He didn't leave that house with a sense of charity swelling in his chest. He left with a sense of direction. What Elijah had done wasn't small. It wasn't about the tire. It was about the way the boy carried himself, the way his mother welcomed a stranger, the way that house, modest as it was, felt warmer than any room in Matthew's estate. He made calls before he even left town. A builder he trusted, a supplier that still owed him favors. Quiet arrangements, private inquiries. This wasn't a donation. It was a restoration, not for their house, for himself. He didn't want his name on a plaque, he just wanted to return something that had been given without price. Perspective. The first truck pulled up 5 days later. Elijah's mother stood in the yard, apron still dusted with flour, her hands frozen in mid-air as a team of contractors stepped out with blueprints and measuring tape. "Mr. Evans?" she asked, blinking hard as he stepped out of his car, smiling gently. Elijah appeared beside her, brow furrowed. "What's all this?" Matthew walked up slowly, clipboard in hand, his tone calm but resolute. "You gave me something I didn't know I needed. I want to give something back. You reminded me how to be human. Let me repay the debt." The mother shook her head, her voice soft but trembling. "You don't owe us anything." Matthew nodded. "I know. That's why I'm doing it." The crew got to work, assessing the structure, marking out areas for reinforcement. Elijah watched, eyes wide, shifting from confusion to wonder. Matthew made it clear to everyone involved, no headlines, no stories, no photos, just work, just respect. The porch was first, new supports, fresh planks, no more creaks. Then came the roof, then the kitchen. It wasn't flashy, but it was thoughtful. Everything was done with care, with the same intention Elijah had shown that day by the roadside. This wasn't a renovation, it was a message written in lumber and nails. Elijah couldn't stay away. By the second day, he was shadowing the foreman, trailing behind the electricians, watching the painters mix colors. He asked questions, not just about what they were doing, but why they were doing it that way. What kind of wood was best? How to use a level? The crew chuckled at first, surprised by his curiosity, but it didn't take long before they welcomed it. One of the contractors, Joe, a broad-shouldered man with a soft voice, handed Elijah a tape measure and said, "You're officially on the team." The boy lit up, not because someone gave him a title, but because someone gave him a chance. He didn't just help, he absorbed. He measured angles with precision. He swept debris without being asked. He even learned how to patch drywall with steady hands. The boy didn't just fix a tire, he ignited a fire. Every moment on that site, he stood straighter, smiled wider, and learned not just how to build, but how to believe that he could. And Matthew, he watched it all unfold like a man discovering color for the first time. He didn't give orders. He didn't supervise. He simply stood nearby, often with a cup of coffee in hand, quietly witnessing something unfold that he hadn't planned. Joy. Not the kind that comes from success or luxury or control. A quieter joy. The kind that's born when you know something you did actually mattered. He had spent his life building towers that scraped the sky, but nothing he had ever constructed had made him feel this grounded. He used to measure his value in profit margins. Now, it was measured in the curve of a boy's learning, the glow in a mother's smile, the sound of laughter coming from the yard. He didn't need accolades. He needed this. The stillness, the meaning. He'd closed more deals than he could count, but this was the first one that paid in peace. When the last screw was turned and the last paintbrush rinsed, the final day didn't feel like a deadline. It felt like a celebration. Neighbors came carrying covered dishes, warm casseroles and cold lemonade, jars of homemade jam, and hands extended in gratitude. Children ran through the now even yard, giggling as they tested the new swing set, which stood tall and rust-free under the late afternoon sun. Elijah beamed as he gave a tour of every room, every corner of the house, now glowing with fresh color and solid walls. His mother stood by the porch, hands clasped over her mouth, eyes glossy but joyful. She turned to Matthew, unable to find words at first, and simply pulled him into a hug. "You didn't just fix our home," she whispered. "You gave us more than we ever knew how to ask for." Matthew didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply nodded, eyes damp, heart full, letting the moment settle into his bones like sunlight through an open window. For the first time in a very long time, He felt like he had truly come home. The porch had cooled by early evening, and the last rays of sun stretched lazily across the fence line as cicadas began their slow chorus. Matthew sat between Elijah and his mother, all three with glasses of iced tea beating with condensation, fingers lightly curled around the comfort of something simple and cold. They weren't talking about renovation schedules anymore, not about paint colors or porch lights or how to patch drywall without leaving seams. Those conversations had already passed. What lingered now was deeper, quieter. They spoke of people, of what it meant to stand up for others without being asked, of what it meant to carry pride without letting it turn into arrogance. Elijah's mom told a story about her own father, how he used to fix the neighbor's roof every spring, whether they asked or not, saying, "When someone needs something, don't make 'em beg for it." Elijah listened, elbows on knees, eyes full of something bigger than teenage restlessness. "I want to do that," he said finally, voice soft but steady. "I want to help people, like you helped us." Matthew turned to him slowly, a smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "You already are," he said, and the boy, who once refused money on a hot roadside, grinned with the kind of ease only truth can carry. Matthew didn't return to his mansion that weekend. In fact, over the following months, he returned to Harlan more than he stayed away. He didn't come back with blueprints or budgets, not anymore. He came back with his sleeves rolled up and a quiet kind of focus. He started small, driving Elijah to a local builder's meetup, helping him organize his notebooks filled with sketches, even sitting in on his school's parent-teacher nights just to understand what Elijah's mother laughed the first time Matthew offered to fix the back step himself, watching him struggle with a stubborn hammer. But he stuck with it, and eventually, so did the town. Folks in Harlan didn't talk much, but they noticed things, and what they saw was a man who didn't just visit. They saw a man who stayed, a man who came to return a favor and ended up restoring a soul. Harlan didn't need a billionaire. What it needed was someone who showed up. And that's exactly what Matthew became. Not in press releases or ceremonies, but in ways that mattered. He started showing up at the coffee shop where locals gathered in the morning, quietly sipping his brew while nodding to the old-timers. He stopped to talk with teenagers hanging around the basketball court, not as a lecture, but as a listener. He asked questions, then waited for the answers. He helped repair fences with the same men who once eyed him warily from across the hardware store. It wasn't philanthropy, it was presence. He didn't want to fund change, he wanted to earn trust. And slowly, piece by piece, he did. Elijah took to the work with the kind of fire Matthew recognized from his younger self, though the direction was all Elijah's own. With Matthew's quiet support, Elijah joined an apprentice program run by a local contractor who had been on the renovation team. His natural curiosity and discipline made him a standout. But it wasn't just the hammer and nail that caught fire. It was his sense of purpose. He started organizing weekend fix-it days for neighbors who couldn't afford repairs, gathering a crew of teens to paint porches, replace broken steps, install railings. He even built a small community garden behind the church using leftover wood and donated tools. The space bloomed with tomatoes, herbs, and laughter. Kids came to plant, seniors came to sit, and Matthew stood back watching it all like a man watching a symphony he'd never expected to hear. Elijah didn't just grow, he bloomed. And Matthew knew without a doubt that this was legacy. Not stock dividends, not foundation grants. This. In the quiet of one of those long evenings, Matthew found himself once again sitting beside Elijah, this time on the new swing set, both gently swaying under the orange sky. He looked at the boy, now a young man, taller, stronger, but still carrying the same unshakable calm, and felt the urge to say something that went deeper than thanks. "You know," Matthew said, "that day I met you, you refused a tip, and I haven't stopped thinking about it." Elijah smiled, but said nothing. Matthew continued, eyes on the horizon. "You refused a tip, but you gave me a direction. I thought I knew where I was going. I thought I was done growing. Turns out I just forgot how to look." Elijah turned to him, not with admiration or awe, but with that same steady look, the one that had unnerved Matthew months ago and now felt like a mirror. "You just needed someone to remind you," he said. As the sun dipped low and the shadows grew long, the yard filled with the quiet hum of a town settling in. Porch lights flickered on, dogs barked in the distance. And Matthew, who once measured his worth by quarterly reports and net gains, now sat content not because of what he had, but because of what he'd given. Or rather, what had been given to him. This wasn't an ending. It wasn't even a full-circle moment. It was the start of something rooted and real, because in the end the lesson was clear, wrapped not in applause or headlines, but in the words he now carried like scripture. It's not what you own, it's what you offer. And what Elijah had offered, a hand, a moment, a model of simple human decency, had rewritten the course of a man who thought he'd already lived his whole story. But kindness doesn't just fix tires, it turns men around. Leave a comment below to let us know where you are watching from, and if you like fascinating stories like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we have another incredible story, and there are many surprises waiting for you in the next part.